the historian of Southport. I mean, because I think Susie channeled it into her, but she knows more probably than anybody in this town knows about Southport that wasn't born here. But anyway, well, then she took a side trip to Florence, Italy, so she takes groups around. That's worth it too. But anyway, I wanted to introduce you.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, while before I really get into the meat of things, and we'll talk to you, I will say a few things about coming here when I did in 1996, before it all happened.
Before we got more than
yeah, 22 years ago, there's been a lot that's happened here in Southport. Not historically, all that's in the books is about the same, But as far as progress, and we'll talk a little bit about that today, as far as progress in North Carolina. But in Southport, we really did have one of those towns where they roll the sidewalks up at 6, 7 o'clock at night. How many of you have been here 20 years or more? Oh, I love talking to you off and on. I love talking to people who haven't heard it before. Really, that was one of the things, coming from Greensboro, actually I'm from Durham. Greensboro is our hometown. We're North Carolinians, you can tell the way I talk. And we were living last in Durham with my husband's career, and retired here from there. So, being in a bigger city, town, Durham and Greensboro, and then, of course, before that, we were all over the United States for 20 years with the U.S. government. But anyway, coming here was quite an adjustment for us, being first time really living in a small town like this. And running to Wilmington 2 or 3 times a week, because that's where we went. We had a couple of grocery stores and a Rose's store here at that time, which is a kind of a little department store. Had a lot of stuff, and we were happy to have that. But I was here when we had the big Walmart controversy. Did we want a Walmart to come into our town? When they started building more of these little housing developments, do we want all those people coming into our town? Now this is coming from people who were tourists here before we became residents. So, and you're probably, maybe you think some of those things now if you've been here for a while. How much longer do we want to let people come here? But to me, it's all been a good thing, really. It has, the progress. And now, I rarely go to Wilmington. I can't tell you the last time I've been in Independence Mall. I don't go to Charlotte that much anymore. If fact be known, I don't even go much further than CVS and McDonald's anymore. That's about the extent. Since I live here in Southport, that I don't travel much outside there and of my region, of my place, except when I go all the way across to Italy, which is my other passion in life besides history, is Italy and travel in Italy. And just so you know, in case it just slips out every now and then, because it's one thing I like to talk about is history, and the other is Italy. I've been for 11 years doing my own tour of Tuscany there, which has been very successful. But anyway, all that to say that it's good in life to have things to look forward to. It's good in life to be involved in something. And we hope all of you are members of the Historical Society. And if you're not, we'd love to have you become members and maybe get involved. And this venue of Tuesday Talks, the second Tuesday of every month, is open to anybody that's got something to talk about, basically. And we try to keep it within the realms of history, local history, or general history that's general enough that would be of interest to you, and things like that. So if you have an idea for something you'd like to present, or you know someone who has a good talk, we're open to listening to your ideas. Bob Surridge is usually here. He's out of town, I think, today, or he's somewhere. Doctor, you know, we all go to those doctor's appointments all the time and things like that. And Musette and I basically are the ones who kind of got this thing rolling a couple of years ago, and we're happy to see it still going for 12 times a year. Well, let's get started. How many of you are North Carolinians? Okay, yay, that makes this even better, because as I say, here it comes, it's slipping out. When I take people to Italy, my favorite people to take are those who have never been to Italy, and the really favorite ones, those who have never been to Europe, because then I get to tell them anything I want to. No, and so here we go today. Well, why did I pick this topic, life in North Carolina from 1820 to 1870, 50 years from an awakening to ruin? Well, I'll tell you exactly why I picked that, because we needed a November speaker, and when Bob was putting the calendar together, he said, we got an opening in November, can you do a talk? And I said, sure. And he said, what's it going to be on? I said, I don't know yet. I'll think of something. And I had just been to a book sale, and I bought this book. Now, you know there's something wrong with a person who will go to a book sale and buy a North Carolina history, geography, and government book, a 8th grade textbook from 1966. But it intrigued me, and it had pictures. And I can remember these type of textbooks, and you probably can too, from back in the day when we studied from books and not off of tablets and phones, and the assignments came over on the internet from our teacher and all that, like my grandkids and great-grandchildren are doing now. But I was intrigued with the textbook. It's official. Look, it has somebody's name in it. Teresa Ritchie, whoever she is, bless her heart. It was new when she got it, so she got to be up in her 60s by now. And so anyway, this was what I bought. So I happened to have this laying around somewhere. So when Bob was still pressing me for a title, I said, okay, I'm going to talk on North Carolina 1820 to 1870. And he said, good. So then I had to make it happen. So that's what we're doing today. Now, another thing about reading history and textbooks and silly things like that, I have lots of friends, lady friends especially, who say, oh, I'm in this book club and that book club. Are you in a book club? And I said, I don't think they have a book club for me, because nobody wants to sit and read old textbooks or history books and that sort of thing. So I don't keep up with the latest fiction. I'm always happy to hear reports from anybody who's reading that. But that's what my reading club is all about, is basically history. And speaking of that, I'll give another commercial for the Historical Society, because we do have a nice selection of books. And you can find those online. We have a very good Historical Society site, and it has this unique title, Southport Historical Society.org. You have to remember, that's the only thing you have to remember. It's not .com, it's .org for an organization. But you will not believe all the information is on there, plus a list of all the books that we have. So if you're interested in reading any history, especially more local history, you can find that there. And also in our store up at the visitor center, most of our books are also displayed there. So.
And at the jail.
And at the jail. So, and some of the local bookstores and vendors around here also carry some of our books. So you never know where we're going to show up. So here's my topic, life in North Carolina, 1820 to 1870. Well, that's 50 years, but what is the significance of those 50 years, do you think? Well, they basically encompass after the Revolutionary War, and then up to the Civil War, and into the Civil War, and just after the Civil War. Don't worry, I'm not going to give you a talk on the Civil War this morning, but what I want to try to give you information about is what it was like here in North Carolina in establishing our state and getting it built up after we were no longer under the thumb of Mother England, and we were a country that needed to have its state start working toward government within the state that also would benefit the nation as well. So, in the beginning, we were, I have to go back just a little bit before 1820. Back in the colonial days, most of us know that North Carolina was one of the 13 original colonies that England settled here in the 1600s, and that in the colonial days, the first King, Charles of England, gave North Carolina and South Carolina. They were one big area called Carolina at the time. He gave that to his friend Sir Robert Heath as a protectorate in 1629. So we had this land, England had this land over here that they were colonizing, so they had to give it to somebody to take care of it. And of course the king wasn't coming over here to mess with it. So he gave it to Robert. Sir Robert didn't do anything with it, never came over here, could have cared less, he just owned it in name basically. So then after old King Charles I died and his son, the beautiful, King Charles II, they were getting a little more interested in what was going over here, over here in their colonies. And so he gave Carolina actually, or Carolina as we call it, to 8 of his friends. And they were the Lord's protectors. So there was more than one of them. They were all supposed to protect this section of land. And that was in a charter that was written up in 1663. Well, these guys didn't bother to come over here and do much of anything either. So the land was just kind of sitting here. People were coming in, trickling in here and there, but that's back to the colonial days. In the original 13 colonies, the 13 were divided into 3 regions. There was New England, those colonies that were up there, the Yankees, or from off, as we say, down here in the South. And then there were the middle colonies, and then there were the southern colonies. And we, at that time, were in the southern colonies. Carolina and Georgia were about the end of it, as far as the 13 colonies. I don't think Georgia was one of them. Wait a minute, anyway. So, the Carolina colony has been around for a while, but there were some problems in the colony. Of course, there are problems anytime, and some of the problems that were happening here in the 1700s were, first of all, the Tuscarora Indians. Now, they were living between the Cape Fear River, that's us right down the street here, and the Roanoke River, which is up further up the coast, around New Bern and up in that area. We just heard the news on that back in Hurricane Florence when that river was flooding and so on and so forth. But the Tuscaroras were living between the 2 rivers here on the coast. And they were the only tribe in this area that was strong enough and big enough to fight the settlers. They had about 1,200 men in their tribe who were fighting men. Now, they wanted to resist the white settlers. Why do you think the Indians, or the Native Americans, or they weren't even Americans at the time, or the native people here, would want to fight the settlers? Of course we know why. They were bringing disease. They were taking their land away from them. They were trying to subjugate them. So they were not happy about that. The war with the Indians broke out, lasted about 2 years, especially around the New Bern area. That's where it started, on the coast, and even moved up into the mountains. So it was not something that was just a little skirmish. It was over with in a week or 2. It was something that the colony had to deal with at length, really, for a couple of years. Now, I could go ahead and tell you the story about those fellows coming up from South Carolina for this reason, to fight the Indians, who ended up building Brunswicktown and Orton Plantation and all that, but that's another story. So, anyway, there was another problem. There were pirates. Pirates were on the coast here in North Carolina for a very short time, just a few years in the mid-1700s. By 1718, the pirates were gone. It was not a problem any longer because they had been hanged up in Virginia and down in Charleston. Our two main pirates, and our most famous pirates here in North Carolina, were Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet. Stede Bonnet was a local fellow. He hung out in the creek right down the street, down Moore Street here, Bonnet's Creek. But anyway, I tell you more about that and the pirates, but that's another story. Okay, so these were problems for the colonists. Now, this is before we were our own entity, and another problem, of course, was settlers. Settlers were coming, and they were coming from other parts of America, of the other colonies, as well as from Europe and Africa. Actually, colonists were coming here in the 1700s from Africa, not in slave ships, but as immigrants coming here to the New World. And so, in 1729, there were about 30,000 people living here in the North Carolina, in the colony of Carolina. By 1775, now we still haven't gotten into the Revolutionary War, there were 250,000. So, in 45 years, the population in the colony grew by over 200,000 people. And these were white people, these were settlers coming in. So when that many people start coming in with their different ideas about how they want to run things and other things about government and so on and so forth, plus having trouble with the Indians, plus at a certain time there having trouble with the pirates, it was not an easy place to live. So, of course, we know what comes next was the Revolutionary War. The winning of the American independence was a hard task. That was not something that was easily done either. And of course, we could have many talks about the American Revolution and how that went, but that's another story. So, what was going on? 13 thinly poor and thinly settled colonies were fighting the most powerful power in the world, England. At that time, she was the strongest country in the world. But independence was finally won for us, of course, in not 1776, but 1781. I think sometimes we get that 1776 date in our minds and we think that was it. But actually that war took about 5 years for us to win our independence. It was hard fought, and the British were very strong, of course, and they were resisting it with all their might. So finally in 1781, Britain did recognize America as a sovereign country and gave us our independence from them. But that did not mean that they weren't interfering here and there. Of course, the next task after winning your independence is to form a government. And so that would become a priority. Well, it was not until 1788 that the Constitution was adopted by 11 states. Remember, there were 13 colonies. Only 11 of them adopted the Constitution in 1778. And then it was, there were 2 more states that were still hanging out. One of them was North Carolina, and the other one was Rhode Island. And so North Carolina and Rhode Island held out until 1789. So this was quite a while after the war was over in 1781, before an amendment called the Bill of Rights was approved. And then North Carolina and Rhode Island said, okay, we're ready to join up with you now. So North Carolina was actually the 12th state to enter into the forming of the government for the new country after our independence, and Rhode Island the 13th of the original 13 states in the country at that time. Well, that didn't mean that everything was hunky-dory by then either. Now, let's look at the map a little bit here. This gives you more of an idea of the states, and Georgia was included in it, so we're good. All the pink states here, except the Mississippi Territory over here, were the original 13 states. These are territories that had already been settled, and people were living there, but they were not states at that time, and they were not actually added in to the original territory, or the original United States in the Treaty of 1788, which was the one that gave us, said to us, okay, go do your own thing from England. So we were not quite done because there was another war with England, the War of 1812. Now, the War of 1812 is probably our most obscure conflict that we had. And although a great deal has been written about it, you probably haven't read much about it, have you? Nor had I. Do you really know what the War of 1812 was all about? Well, I didn't either till I found this textbook. But this is, and I still don't know a whole lot about it. I know the basic facts about it. Even though it was something that was not as, of course, dramatic as the Revolutionary War or the Civil War, it was still fought here on in our land. Now, even though we don't know that much about the war, there are some things that came out of the War of 1812 that we certainly know. And first of all, that was the Star Spangled Banner. That song that we sing and know very well was written during this time. Also, the burning of the nation's capital. Did you know Washington burned down? Yeah, it was during this war. And also, the Battle of New Orleans. Now, who can sing that song? Does it come to your mind? 1814, they took a little trip.
And the Mississippi.
Yeah, the Mississippi.
Well,
Don't shoot them till you look them in the eye. I remember that part. But all of that was part of the War of 1812. Well, that was not the major part of it. That we got a new song and the Capitol burned down, and somebody sang a song about going down to New Orleans or to Louisiana. The British, here's what was happening. It was actually a war over there in Europe, and it kind of got over here by mistake. Bonaparte, Napoleon, was the big guy over in Europe around this time, and France and England were fighting each other. And it was mostly naval battles over there. They were fighting to acquire ships and to acquire land and to become, of course, we know that Napoleon wanted to be the emperor of all of Europe, of all of the world if he could, but that didn't last long. But the British were seizing ships because they needed more ships and more sailors, more men to fight the French. So, whenever the American ships were going over there, taking goods and trading and all that sort of thing, they just seized the ships. During the war, the British seized 1,500 of our ships. 1,500 of our new country's ships. Well, that is not setting well over here at all. Also, the ships were worth about $60 million at that time. That was a big financial loss for the new country. Also, they had confiscated or constricted or taken 6,000 American men and made them be British sailors and soldiers. So, and they weren't the only ones. The French were doing the same thing whenever they could seize an American ship. So it was not a safe time to be running back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean with trading in goods and that sort of thing. So this made the Americans very angry, of course, and also the Americans wanted Canada. Canada, you know, is part French and part English, part British, whatever. So that was a nice big swath of land up there north of us that would add tremendously to the welfare and the well-being of our new country. So we decided, well, if they're going to be fighting over there, we'll see if we can get Canada in the mix and all that sort of thing. But anyway, all of that to say that finally, after about 2 years or so, that everybody got tired of fighting, or at least the British and the Americans did, and they signed what's called the Treaty of Ghent, which is over in Europe. Holland, I think, or the Netherlands is where Ghent is. And they agreed that nobody won the war, they were just going to stop. And that's how the War of 1812 ended. They just signed that treaty and said, we're all tired of this, forget about it, we're not doing it anymore. So no one came out the victor. Now we have a monument down on our waterfront that has to do with the War of 1812. There are really no battles fought here in North Carolina. Most of the fighting that happened here in America was on the water or whatever, but we did have lookouts and we did have maybe a little skirmish or two or that sort of thing. I didn't get into it deep enough. That's another story. Somebody can come and do a talk on the War of 1812 for us. But we have a monument down there that the daughters of the War of 1812 put there years and years ago, long before Musette and I got here. That is a monument to some of the men here in North Carolina on the coast who had a little bit to do with the War of 1812. So that was what was happening at that time. We still haven't got to 1820. Don't worry, we'll get there. All right. Whoops. So what happens next? Now, between 1815, after the 20 years after the War of 1812, many of the states were carrying out their programs of development, new country, new states, everything's going well. But North Carolina was doing little to nothing to better its people. They were just, okay, everybody just do the best you can was kind of the attitude that we had. It was more like a do-nothing government that we had here in North Carolina for about 20 years. And North Carolina began to be ridiculed by the other states around us as the Rip Van Winkle state, because we were happy just to be lying under a tree and sleeping away and not really doing anything that would build up our state. And so until North Carolina decided to wake up and break away from this do-nothing policy, we weren't getting anywhere. From say 1815 to 1835, for about 20 years there. Nothing very much was happening here. What was holding us back? What was keeping North Carolina from moving forward? First of all, lack of good water routes. You've got to be able to get around if you're going in your state and have good water routes, either on the coast or within the state if you're going to move goods around. People are going to manufacture, or they're going to produce with crops, whatever, something, but they're not doing them any good if they can't move it to a market somewhere. We didn't really have a very safe, deep harbor. Our harbor here at the end of Howe Street is the deepest natural harbor in all of North Carolina. But what happens trying to get into that deep harbor? You got to get over the bar. You have to get over the Frying Pan Shoals out there at the end of Bald Head Island. And many, many, many ships have been wrecked there as long as far back as the 1500s when Europeans were coming here. They were wrecking out there. That happens all up and down the coast of North Carolina because we have barrier islands that look like a jigsaw puzzle that hasn't been completely put together for our state, with all these little islands out there, and it also lends itself to becoming the graveyard of the Atlantic because there are so many broken up ships out there. So there was really no good, safe deep harbor at that time. The Cape Fear was the best water route that our state had. The Cape Fear River is the only river in North Carolina that empties directly into the Atlantic Ocean. All of the other rivers in our state go into a larger body of water, one of the sounds up north, or into larger rivers. And the Cape Fear being one of the largest rivers. There are a lot of small rivers that feed into the Cape Fear in the 200 miles or so that it goes up into the middle of the state, up around Pittsburgh, Asheboro, up in that way is where it begins. But it did come down through Fayetteville and also Wilmington, which was a very good thing. So these lacks of water routes was one of the reasons it was holding us back. We could not be very prosperous without it. Now, where were the most prosperous places at that time? Here on the coast, along the Cape Fear River, mainly, and maybe 2 or 3 other rivers, and they were the plantations that were doing rice and other crops and products at that time. We'll talk about a little bit more. Also, there was poor farming conditions. The swamp and the damp area down here around the coast made it almost impossible to farm this area. If you're trying to grow anything here now, you may still be running into that. My husband was very frustrated when we first arrived here about trying to make a garden grow, or even tomatoes, or that sort of thing. The mountains were too rocky. Have you been to the mountains and tried to grow anything up there? That's not so easy either. The best place to farm here in North Carolina is in the Piedmont area, where I'm from originally, in Greensboro and that area there, before you get in the mountains and before you get down here to the swamps. So anyway, they could grow things there, but guess what? Couldn't move them anywhere. There was no water transportation there. So that was something holding us back. Another thing was little manufacturing. Very little manufacturing going on during this 20-year period from 1815 to 1835 because there was no money and we were a very poor state, and there were no investors to invest in North Carolina because there was no way to get the goods anywhere else. Now, we were trading some with Virginia and with South Carolina because it was easy to get to Virginia and South Carolina, bring things here to the coast, Wilmington, Fayetteville, whatever, take them by boat. But that was not enough to sustain the whole state. And of course, South Carolina, especially Charleston, and up in Virginia, they were pretty proud of their state and the progress that they were making. One of the things that we always talk about here with pride is that North Carolina is a valley of humility that's stuck between two mountains of conceit. Virginia and Charleston, South Carolina. All of Virginia with their first families of Virginia. And the Charlestonians, who of course are the most elite. A little tongue-in-cheek and sarcasm there, but we North Carolinians just do the best we can with our what we got. Now, also the East was against the West. This was in North Carolina because the representatives in the General Assembly at that time quarreled, and they worked only for the welfare of their section of the state, and also they did not agree on what they should do. All the wealthy landowners were down here in the East. All the poor folks were up in the Piedmont and the mountains. They had representation in the General Assembly at that time by how many counties they had. So when you don't have much going on, you don't have that many counties. They were just making new counties or new places down here in the East, one right after the other, because they were progressive. So that was a problem. Another problem was immigration to other states. You know, I just said that by 1778 or whenever there were over 200,000 people here. Well, they started looking for better opportunities and decided to move away. By 1830s, nearly the counties declined in population, and by 1850, nearly 1 in every 3 people who had been born in North Carolina had moved away. 1 in 3. So you see the population is declining because there's no opportunities here. There's nothing to do to make money. So the chief need that they had here was, also there was, of course, the need was for transportation. That was the chief need. That's why we couldn't progress as far economically. And then there was a great need for education. Illiteracy in 1840 was very prevalent. Only 1 out of 4 white people could read, and practically all the black people could not read or write. Some parents, of course, were teaching their children in the home, or they hired a tutor, or several neighbors would get together and try to start a school. And when they started these schools, they had a very unusual name. They were called Old Field Schools, and I had never run into this term before until I was studying this, Old Field Schools. And this is the Poteet Old Field School in Caswell County. And they were called Old Field Schools because they were old buildings sitting out in a field. And the group of parents or whoever was getting together to hire a teacher to come teach children for a couple of months during the year would say, well, they can use that old shed or that old building out in the field that we're not using anymore. So they became known as Old Field Schools. Also, of course, we know about one-room schoolhouses. We've seen movies and we've seen pictures of those for a long time. And the other thing that was happening is at this time, they were trying to, or some people were starting academies, which was a privately owned school for a little higher education than what they would get in an old field school or in a being tutor or whatever. And so these academies or boarding schools, many times they were if they didn't live close enough, began to pop up so that especially boys, not so much the girls, but the boys could come and be further educated. But qualified teachers were very hard to find. Now this picture that you see up here is an academy. Actually, it looks a little familiar to us, and it should, because it is the Masonic Building that we have now, and it just looks a little different when it was first built. But it was built with the combination use of it being an academy, a school at that time, and also the upper floor, the top floor, would always be used for the Masonic rites and all as part of the Masonic organization. So the bottom floor was used for many years, right up into World War II, for other things, but always the Masonic temple or area on top. And it's been through some metamorphosis since this picture was done. But anyway, boys could prepare for college at one of these academies, and by 1825 the state legislature had given permissions for 127 of these academies. You couldn't just open one up, you had to have permission. But only 13 of the 127 allowed girls that girls could go to. But that's a whole nother program we'll work on that sometime. All right, but we did have the University of North Carolina. It was the only college or university that was established in the state prior to 1830. And it was open only to boys with charges so high that there were very few students. Even the wealthiest parents sometimes really could not afford to send their children there, or if they could afford to send their sons to college, many times they preferred to send them further up north to Yale or Princeton or to one of the Ivy League colleges at that time because they had more prestige. So hardly anyone felt like it was the duty of the state to do anything about education. Now that was the whole thing. No free education for the children, no matter how young or old they were, and only the university was available for higher learning, and that was very expensive at the time because it was not getting that much in the way of state funds. So who comes along but Archibald Murphy? Archibald Murphy was one of our true heroes in the state of North Carolina at this time. He was served as a senator from Orange County down around Raleigh-Durham area for several years. He had studied at the university. He had become a noted lawyer, and he was also a law teacher and a judge. But he was very sad about the poverty and the ignorance that was here in our state, and he wanted to help improve those conditions. So he had a plan, an overall plan actually, not just for education, also for the infrastructure and building roads and railroads and trying to get our state opened up so we could do better. So he had this plan, he put it out there, and the state was really not ready to wake up. It really didn't want to do much about it, so it failed. The Murphy plan failed, and North Carolina continued to slumber for a few more years. So now we get to 1835. This is a turning point for North Carolina when the General Assembly first rose to the occasion and changed the state constitution that had been in existence since 1778. They changed that in 1835, and they made some changes. First of all, these were some of the things that helped us to awaken at that time. There were constitutional changes. One of the things that's surprising is the vote was taken away from the Negroes or the black people who had immigrated here. Okay, the General Assembly met every 2 years, and they were meeting every year, so they changed that so they would only meet every 2 years. But one of the things they did was take their vote away. Why and how? Because of the rich plantation and wealthy landowners in the East who had all of the vote, most all of the votes in the General Assembly and the influence, did not want the black people to be able to vote because they were afraid of their power being taken away from them. By this time, we are getting more into the slave labor in the plantations and so on. That's way another story, so we won't get into all of that. But that was a very surprising thing that helped, or not, maybe didn't help, but was part of the constitutional changes. Also, they finally decided that Catholics could hold office. Before this, Catholics and Jews could not hold office here in North Carolina because their constitution in 1778 said only Christian or Protestant people could hold office. So those were the things they were dealing with at that time. They still didn't include the Jewish population at this time. Probably were very few of those, but some. But they did allow Catholics to hold public office. Also that they would increase the House of Commons to 120 members, and then the number of senators would have, there would be 50 of those. So for the first time, the people in the whole state, not just the richest ones, were beginning to play a part in the state policies. Now, the Whig Party was also another thing that happened at this time. This was a new party that had started up in opposition to the Democratic Party at this time. This was a big deal for the state to have a new political party to deal with, and new ideas from them. Also, the development of the railroads was very, very important. They were energized, or this development for the railroads was energized about 1835. The Wilmington and Raleigh Railroad, which changed its name later to the Wilmington and Weldon, which we recognize around in our area here, when the citizens of Raleigh failed to show enough interest in it, they changed the name of it and brought the support more down here to the east. It was founded in 1833, and to encourage construction, the state government purchased 40% of the railroad tracks, or the stock, and the 161-mile route also brought in people in the Wilmington area here, as well as taking the route up to Weldon, which is just above Rocky Mount here. So it started down here in Wilmington and went up here all the way up to Weldon, 161 miles of railroad, which at that time, and this is surprising, this is another thing that we can be proud of here in North Carolina way back in the 1830s. This was the longest railroad line in the world at that time. And it was completed in 1840. And the state also bought 2/3 of the Atlantic and North Carolina Railroad running between Goldsboro and Morehead City, that was another route, as well as 1/2 of the Western North Carolina Railroad. So we began to open up a little bit at this time, because railroad cars, railroad tracks were important to move things around. Here's a picture of also some of the first trains there in Wilmington, and that's our little train station right there. That postcard was the train station here in Southport, which was right down by the old cemetery, and it burned down back in the 40s, and also it didn't get here until 1911. So we were way behind, but we were not. Hey, if you're coming to Southport, you ain't going much further unless you get on the boat. So we were like the end of the line, so to speak. So why bother to put down track just to bring people over here to have a nice vacation, or for coaling or whatever. That's a whole nother story about the railroad here. But another interesting thing that we began to develop here in North Carolina at that time were plank roads. Now these were the precursors of paved roads and freeways and all those ways of getting around. Plank roads, many of our nation's roadways, of course, were first dirt roads and mud paths, and then they became the roads as the earth was packed down in them. So a modern movement at that time, in the mid-1800s, was to build these plank roads, and they were laid over in railroad log fashion. They would put the logs, you can probably see a little bit here how this was done, and there, it looked like a railroad. And then they would put a plank or another flatter board on top of those timbers that they had down. So actually these were almost like railroad tracks without the railroad, without the trains. Most of them were 8 feet. The log foundations were in various lengths, but most of them were 8 feet long, 8 feet going this way. And they built these for the wagons, of course, and the width of the roads was 12 feet or more. Downtown areas, sometimes they made them a little bit wider so 2 wagons could pass at the same time. That would be a problem if 2 wagons came at the same time. Somebody's got to get off in the dirt for a while, but whatever. So, but the maintenance that was involved in keeping these things going, and of course the wood would rot away after a few years, and there were just a lot of problems with them. So most of the time when they became impassable or they were no longer functional, they didn't do much to maintain them or to keep them going. But for a while, these were very important because they could move stuff around. Here's big bales of hay or cotton or whatever he's got piled up on top of that wagon going down one of the plank roads. And one of the most famous one of those was the one that went from here to, from Wilmington to Fayetteville or in that area. So anyway, that was plank roads, and so that was helping with transportation. Remember, that was the chief problem in our state at that time, was transportation, was a way to get things moved around. Well, then of course schools, public schools was a big deal during this time also. The first public school law was passed in 1839. Now remember, we're up to 1835 to 1860. We're in that area now, about 25, 30 years. So public school law was passed. Any county or district who could get up $20 and have a building to meet in could get permission from the state to have a public school, and the state would give $40 toward that for the year. So they could hire, with their $20 from the community and $40 from the state, $60 to hire a teacher, which would bring a teacher into a little schoolroom that they had to also show that they were providing for 2 to 3 months out of the year. Of course, we were still a farming state at that time. Remember, they needed those children on the farms most of the time. So schools took a back seat to being on the land, but at least we were getting to this point by 1839 that the state was willing to put some money into the public schools. And also more colleges were being established, especially by the churches. And we are a state now that is full of colleges. We have many, many colleges in North Carolina, and quite a few of them are still from the church colleges that were begun back in the early days. This building here is the first public school, free school that we had in the state. And this was in
Williamsburg. It's in Warren County.
Okay, yeah. And then another picture over there just showing about what one of these buildings would have looked like at that time that they would put together for the school. So we still have the road sign up for that. Besides, here's another little kind of plug too. If you ever want to look at anything really interesting on the internet, go to the North Carolina road signs, or they have a special name. Do you remember, Charles, what those are called, or whatever? But every one that we have here in the state is on the internet, online. And it's very interesting to go there. You can really learn a lot about the history of our state through our road signs. And when there are a lot of them around here, we see them everywhere. So that's an interesting way also to get interested in what's going on in North Carolina history. So the other thing that was going on, of course, was the state capitol had burned down. Remember, we talked about that already. And it was being rebuilt in Raleigh in 1794, or had been destroyed in 1794. So they completed the new Capitol building in 1840 during this time period at a cost of $530,000 at that time to build this beautiful new Capitol building in Raleigh. Also, at that time, there was a little friction going on between Raleigh and Fayetteville. Fayetteville really wanted to be the state capital, but they didn't win out. It had been in Raleigh before, so they decided to keep it in Raleigh. And so Fayetteville did not become the capital of North Carolina at that time in the 1830s. So anyway, by this time also towns began to grow, especially after 1860. There were 25 towns in our state. And they were, Wilmington was number one, was the biggest city in the state. New Bern was next, Fayetteville, Raleigh, Salisbury, and Charlotte. Charlotte, can you believe that? Our biggest city now had to take the bottom rung back in those days when there were only 25 cities in North Carolina. But remember that North Carolina was still an agricultural state. And even though we had some pretty good-sized cities by that time. We were still agricultural, still into farming. Also, another thing that was helping at that time was there were more newspapers in the state than there had ever been before, so people could get news, more people were reading books, and the volume of mail was greater. More information could come into the state through the mail. In 1860, North Carolina was in many ways a new state, awake and prosperous, and very different from the sleeping giant of the earlier days. Now, what else was going on was industry and manufacturing. And this I took just a photograph out of my good old textbook here of the map that I thought was very interesting to show the types of manufacturing that were going on in 1860 here in North Carolina. And if your eyes are good enough, you can see that the round was the turpentine. You see that's all down in our area here where the longleaf pine is. Tobacco factories, the triangles, they were all up in this way, not that many of them at this time. Cotton mills, the squares, were in a lot of those in the Piedmont area. The tobacco, as you can see, is up around the Virginia border there. Cotton mills. There were some rice mills, very few of those. The X's would be along the coast here, and they were, because in North Carolina, and right here by Brunswick Town, and the plantations along our Cape Fear River were about as far north as you could go and grow rice. Rice was grown mostly down below us, South Carolina, especially Georgia and the Brunswick Islands and all in that area. So there was not much rice growing going on up here because the weather was not conducive to that, except right here, actually, at our back door, front door, side door, wherever Brunswick County is. And then there were some iron works, and naturally they would have been more up in the mountain area. And guess what? Some gold mines. Well, let's go back to the turpentine first. Turpentine industry was very important because tar, pitch, and turpentine had been leaving here since the early colonial days because they had to have the tar and the pitch to build ships with, and England needed that very much because they were building ships all the time, and the tar and pitch was being processed and sent over to England, and then also the turpentine was a big industry as well. Now, and we have the nickname what? The Tar Heel State. And we've heard all kinds of stories about that. But this one makes sense. That due to the relationship with tar, pitch, and turpentine, this occupation was considered a demeaning occupation. People didn't grow up saying, oh, I want to be a turpentine worker, or do pitch and tar. So it was demeaning work, and especially in the early colonies. So it was continued. They would say, oh, they're just tar heels. They're out there working with those pine trees, trying to get tar and pitch out of the pine trees. So it was more of a derogatory term then, but don't you dare tell anybody at UNC Chapel Hill that it's a derogatory, unless Musette wants to. She's a Duke alumni, the Duke fan. But the Tar Heels, one, I guess, of the many ways that have been suggested that the name came from. But anyway, turpentine was a leading industry in 1860. It was concentrated in Bladen County, which is one of our neighbor counties, of course, New Hanover and Cumberland counties. More than 1,500 plants, 1,500 plants or distilleries, produced turpentine valued at $5,300,000 in 1860. So you can see what a monumental thing this was to our economy. Now, the first documented discovery of gold in the United States was in 1799 at John Reed's farm here in North Carolina. And they found a 17-pound gold nugget while they were fishing, and in one of the creeks there. And this started the first gold rush in the nation's history, right here in North Carolina. And it led the nation in gold production until the great gold rush in California in 1849. When the 49ers left here and went to California, Before 1860, about $50 million worth of gold was mined in North Carolina. You'd think we'd be a very rich nation, wouldn't you? 17.5 million of that was coined into money. In fact, they built a mint, the U.S. did, in Fayetteville, to mint some coins during this time. I know some of you say Fayetteville, but here in North Carolina it's called Fayetteville, really, and I'm trying not to say Fayetteville, I'm trying to say Fayetteville. But anyway, the future seemed full of hope and happiness and prosperity. I mean, there was gold, there was turpentine, there were roads being laid, there was railroad tracks being put down, all of things, but something dreadful happened to end this age of progress, to destroy much of what we had built up by this time, and that brought fear, ruin, and poverty to the people again. But what was that thing? Civil War. The North and the South could not agree. The South, the southern states, believed that their stand on slavery was just and their concerns over the tariffs were fair, and that their culture and their lifestyle were to be treasured, and they believed in the rights of states to determine their own destiny, and they knew their section of the country was best, and we still do know that. But the North, the northern states believed that their stand against slavery and their concerns over tariffs and culture and lifestyle made them the favored and therefore the best section of the country. And I'm sure there are some who still believe that. So, what happened, of course, there was an election. And when there's an election, there's usually trouble that follows. You think? Anyway, the election of 1860 was a powerful new party had formed in the North and spread rapidly to the West. Guess what this new party was? The Republicans. And they were openly attacking, of course, slavery, and they wanted to lead the southern states away from that, and they wanted to elect a Republican president. And the Republican Party was able to do just that thing in 1860, and they elected who? Our famous brother and president, Abraham Lincoln, was elected president during that election year of 1860. He took office in March of 1861. And of course, this fired the South into action. It was only a few weeks later that South Carolina and some of the other states in the lower South seceded from the United States. And that was a result of having elected Abraham Lincoln as the president. And what they thought was going to follow there. So in February of 1861, even before he took office in March, they formed the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Davis of Mississippi as the president of the new Confederation of States. So at this time, what had happened is the Union is dissolved. There's no more Union because there's the United States and there are the Confederate States. Lincoln believed that no state had the right to secede from the Union and that it was his duty to preserve the Union. So after these shots were fired at Fort Sumter, he immediately called upon the states who were still in the Union to send 75,000 soldiers from each state. Now, at this time, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee were still in the Union. But when Lincoln called for 75,000 soldiers from each state to come and fight, these four states said, we're not going that direction. We're going to secede too and become part of the Confederate States. So that's when the other states, and you can see the dates here, that they seceded from the Union. And this is the first group, the lower South, that went. And then there's light blue group, these are the other four states, including us, who went after Lincoln came into office, and this demand went out for the troops. So that's how we basically got in to the Civil War. we were on the fence until we had to make that decision whether we were going to send 75,000 soldiers to fight for the Union. So, of course, what happens now is the American Civil War that lasted from 1861 to 1865. There were advantages. Here's another page out of the book. For the North, there were advantages for the South. You probably can't read those that closely, and I won't take the time to go every one of them. But you can see just by sheer number here that the North had far more advantage than the South did in some ways, and in most ways as far as fighting this war. North Carolina's blockade runners were very important to the strategy of the war. This is one of the things, the main things that North Carolina contributed to the war at that time, right out here in our harbor, and we still have the remains of that history here in Southport. So that was quite an advantage that we had, because supplies were coming in for the Confederacy from England, basically, and our blockade runners who were running around those big blockade ships that the president had sent down here could get to the West Indies and all the way over to England and bring back supplies for the Confederacy. But that's a whole another talk. Okay. Now, we know that the South, of course, was defeated at Appomattox, and the war ended in April of 1865, almost 4 years to the date from the first shots that were fired at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. And, of course, for a great loss for the whole country. The South was defeated. Lee surrendered to Grant. More than 40,000 North Carolina men from age 16 to 60 had lost their lives. Thousands of them came back home handicapped and maimed for the rest of their life. So the South, of course, was devastated. It left economics of these 11 seceded states in shambles, and the pre-war social system was in disarray. Everything was a mess in the South. The paper money was worthless. Few people had any gold or silver. State bonds that had been floated before and during the war, and people who had actually loaned their wealth, their money, to the Confederacy or to the state of North Carolina. These are state paper money. All of this was no good anymore. They could not cash in this paper and get their gold, silver, their money back. So everybody was tired. They were many of the soldiers made their way back home best way they could on foot. Most of them were penniless. They had to start all over. They got home. They had nothing there, no crops in the field, no cattle, no stock. The houses, the barns were tumbling down. Everything was in ruin. So it was very difficult. But they stood up, said, okay, we've got to keep moving on. We've got the land. We'll try to farm it again. And of course, dirt poor farmers began all over again at this time. The wealthy families were no better off than the little farmers at this time, because they had acres and acres of land, but they didn't have the slaves. They didn't have the people to work that land to bring in any kind of crop. So they were basically just sitting on land that they could not make any money off of, and no one had the money to buy their land from them. So that was a sad situation as well. In order to keep the peace and the order here in the South, the president sent down troops, the northern troops, to come, and they stayed here until 1877 here in North Carolina. It was martial law, so to speak, with the troops that were here. So this began, of course, the Reconstruction period. Everything was going along pretty good. Our President Lincoln had a Reconstruction plan that he wanted to heal the nation's wounds and make everything good again and make it easy for the southern states to come back into the Union. But before he had time to apply that plan, he was shot at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. And so President Lincoln's plan kind of went down the drain. And the new president, who had been the vice president, Andrew Johnson, became the president. He was a Democrat from Tennessee, but he had been born in North Carolina, by the way. He was born in Raleigh, to poor parents, and in his youth he ran away to Tennessee, and he picked up some education there. He also married a rich woman, and he rose to politics and became very prominent as a representative in Congress. So he had remained in the Union when Tennessee seceded, and he was not liked by the Southern leaders, of course. He was our new president, and he was not well liked by the Southerners because of the disagreements with radical Republicans in Congress, which led to his impeachment. So he was our first president who was impeached. These radical Republicans, he was a Democrat, wanted revenge on the Southerners, and they saw opportunities to get into the business of trying to take over and do what they wanted to do here in the South. So anyway, not a very good situation going on with our next president, and he was impeached because of his beliefs. And one thing, that the tenure of the president, that it should be longer than it was. You can read about Andrew Johnson and find out a lot more things, or give us a talk on him someday if you like. So, I keep hitting them. Readmitting the states, and I'm almost done. Many white Southerners refused to vote. They just said, no, we're not going to vote. And so they had to say, okay, we'll vote. Thousands of newly registered African American voters voted because they were free now, they could vote. The Republicans gained control of the southern state governments, and by 1868, 7 states were readmitted, including North Carolina. And so you see, we were pretty quick. We wanted to get back in as quick as we could. The war was over in 1865. 1868, we were back in. And then it was not until 1870 that 3 other states were restored to the Union. So, while the Republican Party was in control of North Carolina from 1868 to 1870, the state debt grew rapidly. Here's where things are going on now in 1870, 68 to 70. The debt grew rapidly in our state. Taxes were increased. That's not a good thing when you're lying in ruin to have your taxes increased. Public money was wasted and stolen because the government was in such disarray in our state at this time. Nobody knew what was happening with whatever money we had. And crime was widespread because when people are poor and hungry and jobless, what do to get what they need? Usually they resort to crime. So it was dark and dreary in North Carolina once again. So we go back from an awakening that we had in those 20 years between 1835 and 1850, when things began to look good, to the ruination of the war and the dark time that we had after that, because Reconstruction after the Civil War, and Musette does a whole 6-week class on Reconstruction. This period was a hard time in the South, and there were large economical, social, and environmental changes that took place for our defeated southern states, not just North Carolina. Newly freed slaves would begin building new schools and churches and buildings and building new homes, which was a good thing. But we're stopping at 1870 here now. What was going on in our state after then with the freedmen, the slaves, the Freedmen's Bureau, which was all controlled by the government, the Ku Klux Klan. Musette's got a good program on that too. So there are lots of things that began to come into play now during Reconstruction and after the Reconstruction time. And what about those carpetbaggers who made their way south? That's a whole nother story too. So what happened after 1870 in North Carolina? Well, somebody's going to have to get busy and doing it. And so you get busy studying on the internet or find yourself a good old textbook. And when you get ready to give us a program on what happened after Reconstruction or that time, or maybe we can talk Musette and coming back and doing that one for us. Yes. Then we'll know some more about our state during that time. Thank you very much for your attention.